think the most common one is associating lean with being cheap. The problem is that common sense is the rarest thing to see in practice. Most people don't practice common sense, and that's the challenge. And so people are not allowed. So I sometimes joke that startups fail because they struggle to find any customers to talk to. But bigger companies usually fail in their projects because they create those barriers to talking to customers. They stop talking to their own customers.
Hello everyone, welcome to Untrapping Product Teams. Here is where we speak the naked truth about creating digital products. And today it's a very special episode. We have Ash Maurya with us. He is the creator of the Lean Canvas, CEO of LeanStack, and author of great books like Running Lean and Scaling Lean. Running Lean is one of my favorite books here. I really recommend to everyone, and I have read this probably 3 times. Read, listened, can only recommend. It's very powerful. So Ash, I'm really glad to have you here.
Thank you, David. You're too kind. Thanks for having me.
I learned you are writing a new book, so we're going to explore this today as well as your previous book and see what we can bring value to our listeners.
Sure.
Cool. So one thing I want to explore with you, because you have been a mentor, a leader, and the lean movement, so to say, and what I want to hear from you is how your experience shaped your perspective on lean in product management.
Sure. So I tell everyone, I think most people who joined the lean movement were all practitioners to begin with. We were all building products, sometimes for many, many years and getting stuck along the way. And so when lean came out, there were some ideas that Eric Ries and Steve Blank started to share that seemed to be problems we had seen, but their solutions were kind of interesting, worth exploring. And that's how I got excited and plugged in. And then again, when you hear people share ideas that are a bit counter to common practice, there's skepticism. So a lot of us decided we would run some of our own tests, right? So we had all talked to customers, but the difference between knowing how to talk to them versus not was what was different this time around. And so I started, like a lot of the folks, saying, let me take some of these early ideas and run some experiments on my own product. So I took one of my products, began using some of the techniques, and then along the way, I transparently shared all my learnings. That led to blog posts, that led to some readerships, and then that eventually trickled into some of the tools like the Lean Canvas, the books. So I had no master plan in the beginning to be an author, to do any of the stuff that I'm doing today, but it just customers pull you in directions, and it kind of happened along the way.
So you took the flow and you went all in different place and so on. And it feels to me like a lot of, you knew the mindset and you followed the mindset. You didn't have the plan, but as you mentioned something quite interesting, how to talk to customers, right? Can you elaborate a little bit on this? Because I believe that many people have this question.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think most people who have managed a backlog or even looked at feature requests coming in drown in, like, they get overwhelmed with lots and lots of ideas. And when you deconstruct them just a little further, you realize that they are really solutions disguised as problems. So customers are often very good about asking things, and when we tell them, what's wrong, what can we build, they'll give you a list of 10, 20 things to go do. And I had done this in my startup. I said, tell me what you want, I will build that, and hopefully you'll buy. I did that for a long time, and they came back and the list kept growing and growing and growing, and they never bought anything. Meanwhile, I had another group of customers who were very quiet, and they were paying customers, and they weren't really saying much. And so I went and talked to them, and they told me something that was quite surprising, which is, what you have is actually good enough, but you keep building more things, and I have to keep finding the things that I want to use. And so that's when I realized I was talking to the wrong people. I was trying to talk to sometimes non-customers or non-users, asking them, what do you need to buy? And those folks would never buy, right? And then the folks who actually were getting value, I was making the product more complicated for them. So that's kind of a simple example of how we sometimes get enamored with, let's just listen to all the feedback we get, but not all feedback is equal.
Yeah, That is a very valuable perspective because you mentioned about the backlog and so on, and this guy's solution. And this is what many product people struggle with. And sometimes they realize they are not really a product manager, they are a backlog manager because they get loaded with all of this. And it's quite interesting what you said about talking to the quiet ones. It is a little bit, I would say, even unthinkable for many companies. They talk to the loud ones. Let's talk to the ones complaining. Let's talk to, but they don't look at the quiet ones that are paying customers, satisfied. Most probably, they keep paying. So it creates a lot of learning. But one thing is you mentioned about removing features. Like you keep adding, and then the product becomes confusing. But how do you encourage people to have this thinking of removing feature when everyone is trying to bombard you with a roadmap full of features to deliver?
Yeah, so it's challenging, and this is why one has to take a more holistic approach and more in more recent terms. Back then, I didn't have a term for this, but now jobs to be done has become pretty popular. But if we
Mm-hmm.
think in terms of outcomes or what is the bigger context, why are people using these features at the end of the day? What's the outcome they're trying to drive? So if someone says, I want to be able to print a lean canvas, I can go ahead and say, oh, you want it, this font and this size, does it need to be, I can get like enamored in all the features. But if I ask the more interesting question, like what will you do with the printout? And then I realize they're going to present it to their managers, then it changes perspective because maybe they don't need a printout. Maybe I can give them a slideshow feature or I can give them something else. So when we think about the bigger context as product folks, it gives us many more ideas to come up with even better solutions than sometimes the customer asks. And here I'll just channel Steve Jobs. He famously said it is not the customer's job to know what they want. They can tell us where they struggle, and it's really our jobs as product folks to figure out the best way to unstruggle them or to get them to the outcome that they really are trying to achieve. So that's how I try to think of features as stringing them together towards a top of the hill, a desired outcome where there's a smile on people's faces versus
Mm-hmm.
just steps. There are lots of process steps we can optimize, but that's not the end game.
Yeah. And it's the conversations we choose to have. As I said, the link canvas, yeah, you can print it. But one aspect that is interesting when you say, for example, what do you do with that? What are you going to use that for? You can lead to the conversation and realize this because sometimes teams get trapped to, okay, we only care about outcomes, so let's not talk about solutions. So customers will come with solutions, and then you ask, like, what are you trying to achieve with that? It's a different thing because then customers perceive like you are challenging them, you are doubting that they need this. And the question you mentioned is a more inviting one, and that's what I like. What are you going to use that for? It's a different one.
Yeah, yeah,
And one thing, like you wrote the two books there some time ago. I think the Running Lean is in the third edition now. So
yeah. Over. I've got the gray hair to prove it, but yeah, it's now over 10 years, almost 12 years old now.
and when you look at the current scenario, how did the concepts inside this book evolved?
So it was very much. So I'll be honest and say I was first writing the blog for myself, and then along the way, based on reader questions, a lot of these were other practitioners, entrepreneurs, founders, product people. Based on their questions, I began to realize that it wasn't just me. Many people were struggling with the same kind of things, and so I got a bit outside my own bubble, started to deliver talks and workshops, and all the questions that I got fueled the content that went into the book, and those questions also fueled newer tools. So Lean Canvas was one of those tools. But then one other question I get is around metrics. How to actually measure metrics for a business or for a product, and so that in scaling Lean I tackled. So to me, it was very much of a, as you said, follow the flow. So
Mm-hmm.
I always had this initial thinking that once the books get written, everything would be done. I could go back to like running my old company had nothing to do with lean. It was just something kind of more in the tech space. But as I wrote the books, more people came, more questions came, more tools got built, and then this became a full-time thing. And to this day, I use my readers or my audience's questions to decide what to work on every year. It hasn't changed since the first book.
That that's a very encouraging perspective. So some people tell me like, yeah, I have many ideas and I'm thinking about writing a book. And based on what you say, you confirm some of my ideas. It's start writing a blog post. Just go to LinkedIn and share what is in your mind and see how people react to that. And then follow the flow. Try to listen to the sign and separate the noise. Because you see where there's pain and where you can invest. And then you said, then as a result, you created the link canvas, which I'm incredibly grateful for because I haven't told you, but I written several business cases and took me ages to do that. So the link canvas saved me at least hundreds of hours.
Yeah. And I think it goes back a bit to the job to be done kind of approach is that really, if you look at the job of a book, it's to share some ideas and in this case, help people who are building products be more successful. And a book is just one packaging. But to your point, you can use a blog post, you can deliver a workshop, you can even just deliver a talk. There are many smaller ways to test what would go inside your book before you write the book. And that was, I know you follow that same process, and that was the process I followed for this book and really all my books for that matter.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the ideas, right? So it's one of the things you say it in the running lean, and I even quote you quite often is your unfair advantage is your learning speed, something between these lines. So how fast can you learn it? Because you need to expose and then test and see. I like testing everything, and when I realize I'm too much behind the computer thinking about something, I say, I'm missing the point. I'm not learning, I'm speculating.
Yep, exactly.
And what I want to explore with you is there are many misconceptions behind the term lean. And you have been in this for more than a decade now. So, what are the most common ones you see?
I think the most common one is associating lean with being cheap. So people look at it as being a very small team, not spending a lot of money. But it goes back to what you just said. Speed of learning is the real superpower or unfair advantage when we're being lean. We try to prioritize what's riskiest, not what's easiest, to speed that learning up. And sometimes that requires spending even more money up front. So if I could spend $10,000 up front versus spread it over 6 months and I could get to a risky assumption validated, I would do that because that just makes sense for the business model. So that's probably the biggest misconception is people associate lean with being cheap and being maybe the others are kind of they think of lean when we use the word like minimum viable product, people think you're building a beta or an alpha or a crappy product and you're just throwing it and learning and iterating. But so those are things that I don't hold. I don't believe those to be the true essence of being lean. It really is
Mm-hmm.
about testing riskiest stuff. And if you're building a minimum viable product, say for a designer, then of course design has to be a big part of it because they're going to judge what's minimum for them is very different than what might be minimum for a non-designer. So this is where everything is relative, and we some of those terminologies get confused, but those are the common misconceptions I see.
Being cheap. Yeah, that's one I haven't actually thought about it because being in Germany now for 6 years, the biggest misconception I see with lean is process aversion. There's no process. Lean is without process and so on. I don't see exactly like that. I see that you can have some process, but it's the mindset, at least for me, accelerating learning. So how do you test the riskiest assumption? How do you ensure that whatever you choose to do, it makes sense so you don't waste? So you reduce waste. That's what I perceive in general.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
And context matters a lot. So it's more about the mindset than the process itself. So what I want to ask, for example, you look in an organization, they have been working with, let's say, feature roadmaps and so on. And the big question is, where do they start? If they want to be more lean, be more towards lean and not so classic and project management and all of, they realize it doesn't work, but they don't know where to start. What do you suggest doing then?
Well, In organizations that are already up and running, I always try to find ways for them to bring the voice of the customer, depending on who I'm speaking with, but bringing that voice of the customer at the end of the day. And we have to trigger for change in the beginning. So, like, if I'm working with developers, I'll usually ask them, you're shipping a lot of features, but do you even know if people are using them? Right? Are you instrumenting or even doing metrics? And one the things we quickly see when you start measuring features that get shipped is that maybe people don't even see them, right, in the product versus how much stuff is being shipped. That's usually a wake up call, and that would be like the first thing. When that happens, then the question is, well, how can we not who do we blame, but how do we now like fix this? Like maybe
Mm-hmm.
we go a bit earlier in the process to the product managers and try to understand where these features came from, and this is where we can start pulling on the thread and bring some of these ideas of let's involve customers in the process of even demoing something before we build it, before we commit, and getting some early validation that people will use this. And even when we ship, let's keep instrumenting and making sure that there is the there's the launch, but then there's actually usage and engagement with the feature, and our outcomes are met. So to me, like that's where it's a big question to answer depending on which group I'm speaking with, but
Mm-hmm.
generally usually comes down to when is the last time you were able to measure whether the product is indeed delivering value to customers. And if we don't know if that's the case, let's start there, and that usually leads to some practices we can do in various places to fix.
That's really practical advice. Bring the wake up call. What is the wake up call? So figure out on that and involving the customer and so on. This is quite helpful because sometimes people don't even know where to start, but maybe it's a little bit about stepping back and saying, hey, where do we stand actually in terms of value? How do we know if whatever we choose to create is delivering what we said? Involve the customers, check feature usability. Not and here we are not even talking about value. We're saying, is anyone actually even using that? And then
Yep.
after we can check if it is actually delivering value because it's still different, using and creating value.
Yeah.
And maybe in these lines, because some weeks ago I got quite excited. I was just on LinkedIn browsing there, and then I saw that you decided to write a new book. And you said it makes total sense to continue because you have running lean, scaling lean, and the next one is coaching lean. And I said, oh, that's quite interesting because it's one of the struggles. That's why I'm asking these questions here. How do you start? Where do you bring this? And so on. What I want to hear from you is like, what is your goal with this upcoming book?
Yeah, so the good news is that a lot of the ideas in Lean are very commonsensical. People read them, love the problem, not your solution, or start with the business model, not your solution. People read these things. Traction is, matters above everything else. Talk to your customers, and everyone nods their heads and seems to get it. The problem is that common sense is the rarest thing to see in practice. Most people don't practice common sense, and that's the challenge. And so the first few years after I wrote the book, I was all about answering the questions we talked about in the framework to answer what's missing. Like, we talked about Lean Canvas to deconstruct the idea, then the metrics was a missing bit. There's another bit around like how do you talk to customers in a way where you don't get bad, misleading answers. So those were like things I worked on. But once those foundational things got built, then I began to realize that many of the teams I was working with, they understood all the theory. They would come to workshops and get an A at the end of it. But when they got back to work on Monday, it was back to business as usual. They were not getting outside the building. They were not talking to customers. And when I would ask them, they would say, oh, either the environment didn't allow them because there was too much friction, inertia, or they were still building things and they wanted to finish that first. So habits got in the way and all those things got in. So I got interested in how do we solve this problem? How do we take teams and transform their thinking? It's about mindset, but how do we do that kind of transformation? And so I began running some boot camps and different kinds of workshops, more hands-on, and that led to a number of like behavior design things and habit things. What we just talked about, like the with the wake up call or the triggering event, is one of those things. Is when I work
Mhm.
with the team, the first thing I try to do is diagnose where they are and what isn't working that they wish could be working, and then we start there. Because if I try to lecture them and tell them go and do all these things, it's more work. They don't want to do them because it's different. They don't like, going outside and doing all these lean things. But if we start with what they want and then we start diagnosing and figuring out what the root causes are, we can get them to do some of these lean things without forcing them. So to me, that's
Hmm.
what led to a set of practices that I began again, teaching and using myself. And then it became enough content to where it made sense to write another book, and that's why, hence, coaching lean.
That sounds really exciting because I can really connect to that. There are many workshops out there, and sometimes I even call as a certification industry that a lot of people get trained and they may receive loads of valuable content. But how do you apply that? Because reality is different. One thing you mentioned, the common sense. I'm working in a very international team, multiple nationalities, and so on. And within all of this, it just adds complexity. What is common sense to me, coming from Brazil, but then living in Germany, married to a Russian, it's very different than what it would be from someone coming from Asia. It changed. And the main point is what you said here, diagnosing, helping them see something that identifying the starting point. Because the question is, okay, I learned loads of this, but where do I start? I sense like you are trying to give, I don't know, you didn't say that, but I sense like this, small victories. So let's help them taste a little bit this and then move on, experiment, learn, and then get excited, and then you apply the next and the next.
Yes, yes. No, I use the word kind of habits because to break a habit, you almost have to build reward loops. And today,
Mm-hmm.
if you just go and lecture at people, if I have a team that is struggling and I say the reason that you're struggling is because you didn't talk to customers, you should go and run 20 interviews and, go and spend 2 weeks not building anything, but try to sell what you build before you do anything else. That's very painful because they've never done this. They get outside and it's almost like saying go run a marathon without any training. It's a very hard thing to do, and most people will fail. And it's common. So that's the empathy we need to have as coaches, is that we can't just flip a switch and say you are doing it wrong. Now go do it correctly. That doesn't work. So this is where, as you said, the little wins. So to me, if I
Mm-hmm.
can instead get them to say, we did this, but we don't know why it's not working, and then we start diagnosing, and maybe we take one customer, have a conversation, get an insight, see if it's repeatable, do some small tests, and that's how you incrementally build it. And the idea is that I used to be a coder, a technical person, that I used to spend more time inventing ways not to talk to customers. I would use surveys and focus groups or vote things in the app. And then one day I started talking to customers, what I would say is the better way or the right way, and my perspective just changed. In one
Mm-hmm.
20-minute conversation, I was able to learn so many new insights that I came up with new ideas that actually changed the engagement of my product with other customers, that I said this is the way. So getting people to experience that, I think that's the magic, but not forcing them, because if you force them, then it's too painful.
Yeah, if you force them, they are not gonna do it. But you make
Yeah.
it simple and you help them see where to start. And I truly connect to this part of coming from the technical side. I was also a software engineer, but how I started was a bit different, and I relate to your part because when I started, I worked in a factory and I could talk directly to the employees. And I was going and asking them all the time what to do and so on. Then eventually I moved to product management and it happened something different. People were blocking me from talking to the users, to the real customers. And I couldn't understand. I said, when I was a software engineer, I was talking and now I cannot talk. So what is going on here? And then I
Yeah.
started seeing that this is more of the reality of many product managers.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, reality, I would say.
Right. And so I think there are also in bigger organizations, what you touched on, and I think that's like the topic in your book is, untrapping product teams, but also the environment. Because one of the things that I do see is that many people are not allowed. So I sometimes joke that startups fail because they struggle to find any customers to talk to, but bigger companies usually fail in their projects because they create those barriers to talking to customers. They stop talking to their own customers, and they only allow certain people to talk. And by the time the people doing the work get the requirements, it's all, an elephant whisper game. It's all jumbled up, and it doesn't really match reality. Um,
Yeah.
so usually when I go into bigger orgs, part of it is working on different levels. You also have to talk to, management or leadership to make sure that they are on board with removing the barriers to talking to customers, because that's definitely a bigger cultural shift, but it's one that's not hard to overcome if the mindset is there, but you have to win that mindset as well.
Yeah. Removing the barriers, because that's the core. If we just try working on different processes, you will get more or less the same results, just in a different way. So you need to remove the barriers. One point you mentioned about the roles, like what I see happening right now is it's becoming easier and easier to create stuff. You have different AI tools here and so on. I was testing one tool, for example. I just put the prompts there and boom, something is created. How valuable that is another question, but something is created. And in this really rapidly changing environment, how do you see the role of the product leader to help the teams create something that is valuable, not the feature bloated things, but something valuable?
Yeah. So I think AI just accelerates that, but even before that, with the internet, with open source, cloud computing, all of these things have been massive leaps in reducing complexity of product development. So for a long time, we've been able to build, and now even more so, as you're saying, anything that we can imagine. But the bigger question is it worth building in the first place? Will anyone care? And so usually what I encourage people to do, and that's this idea of demo sell build versus build demo sell. So don't, even if you can build something fast, to then go test it, you now have the sunk cost fallacy, because you build things, you want to polish it, we fall in love with our solutions, and then we start to kind of get very biased. So a better way for leadership or for even product folks is to have an idea, but make sure that there is indeed a big enough problem worth solving in the first place. So the best way I find to find a problem worth solving is find what people are using today and why is your solution going to be significantly better. So when I look at AI, people usually say, I'm doing something in AI. I'm like, okay, tell me the use case. And if it's say around copywriting, okay, so it's copywriting for agencies. What are they doing today? Are they using other tools, or are they doing this manually? And then do they know they have a problem? Like, what's broken? Are you giving them, what's the axis of better? Is it speed? Is it cost? Is it performance? Like, what is it? Just better, copywriting? So what is it? And so once we ask those questions, we can now compare the old way and the new way and see, is it significantly better? And then let's go test it. So before even if you can build it quickly, let's go and pitch it to some customers, see if they'll buy it or if they'll even agree to wanting to use it. And you'll be surprised, but many times people will say, I'm fine with what I have. It's perfectly okay.
I'm fine with what I have. Yeah.
So it's a process, but to me, it would be going through stages of incremental validation before just building things and throwing it over the fence. And we can test things that start at a leap of faith and turn it into something that could be a hypothesis we run with a small scale experiment, and then we can begin to see, is it really repeatable and scalable? And that's generally the approach, kind of the lean iterative approach of taking an idea and pushing it through all the way.
And the key is demo, sell, and build. And that's one of the challenges people see more in the B2B scenario. Because in the B2B scenario, it's more conservative because the decision making is different. Because in a B2C scenario, the user is a customer, the user is going to buy it and so on. And for you, like, how do you break this barrier? Because what I see happening in the B2B is, hey, I'm not going to burn my credibility here. If I go and try to do a PPT sales, that's what they call it, they're going to laugh at my face. I need a product. I don't have a product. I don't go there. Yeah. But if we build a product nobody uses, then it's even worse.
Right. And that is, but that is a mindset that one can build. And usually it's easier to do than people think if you remove what's at stake. People think I'm going to go and try to pitch something that isn't built, and so the customer is going to ask me all these hard questions. And the thing is, in the beginning, we're just testing interest. If I come to you and say, David, I know you're writing a book. It was a long process. I have this new AI thing where I think you can write a book as good as the one you wrote that took you a year. Maybe it will take you 2 months to do. Would you be interested if I ask you about your process? That's kind of how I'm pitching, right? So I'm not even getting into like an elaborate demo or anything yet. We're just trying to see, is that even something of interest? And you might have reservations and say, I don't trust AI, or I don't believe the quality. I won't have my voice. But that conversation is how things start. And then at some point, I may start, once I explore the problems, I may start showing you some samples or some prototypes or demos, but that can come down the road. But if I don't even get 10 people like you who are ready to have a sit down with me and say, let's talk about this because, yes, I'm interested in the outcome, then why even build something and try to push it down to you? Because you're not interested in the beginning, you wouldn't be interested once it's finished. So,
Yeah. So it's a problem exploration.
yeah.
And that's what people think, like, no, you're trying to sell a solution. And in this kind of conversation, it's more like about understanding the jobs that the person is doing. And can you do something better? Are they showing any signs of frustration? But looking for stories, I'm always looking for the real thing, because you said for you was natural, was about the mindset, and you start writing and so on. But when we go back to your experience of running a company, creating something, what I want to know is a scenario of a turning point where lean actually helped you out of that, the lean mindset.
Sure. I mean, I think there are many. So I would say one of the biggest things, and if you just look at and this is what even got me started, is that I can say there was life before lean and life after lean. So before lean, I got hit with a number of ideas which were very amazing and awesome. I spent about a year putting together my team and building it, talking to a few people, but I was not being very open because this was the build first approach. So it took a year to build it, and then another 6 months after it was built to try to make it work. 3 of my projects didn't really get much traction, and so they didn't go anywhere. So if you look at it, that was like almost 5 or 6 years to build 3 or 4 products. One of them was successful, 3 of them were like not so successful. I had to pivot. After lean, one of the biggest, I think, difference is the cycle time, because we prioritize selling before you build, or let's talk to customers first and see, is there a problem worth solving? It didn't feel that way, but they were more ideas that I killed in the short term because they were just not the right ones. And normally that would seem like a negative thing, but in the long run, you end up building more successful products. So I think this is what I try to tell people, because sometimes people come to me and say, if I use the lean approach, will I be more successful? And so my question to them is, define success. If it is taking the idea you're working on and making that idea work, chances are no, you're going to find that your idea is flawed and maybe it's not that one, but lean will help you learn what's broken and then maybe you can fix that. So to me, I would say that has been the biggest thing, is when I look at just the number of pivots and course corrections I make now, it is much, much faster, and it has become more automatic, where it doesn't even feel like failing. It just feels like learning. It's like, okay, this didn't work. Let's try this other thing because this is what the customer really wanted. And that's, I would say, the biggest change in the way that I work today.
It's about identifying the pivot fast enough.
Yeah, and there always is. I mean, I think statistically, they found that just with startups, most of what they start with, like 70-80% of them are not what works. And what works is actually something that's unrecognizable. It's very drastically different. You think, PayPal, Groupon, all these companies, even Slack, they start doing one thing and then end up entirely somewhere else. And that speed with which you can find the thing that works is ultimately what, lean is trying to get you to do faster.
Yes. It's very related to a conversation I had with one investor, and he had been in the market for 20 years. And I asked, what is the difference between those startups that make and those that don't? He said, one, how fast they can pivot.
Yeah.
The more I talk, the more I realize that, and lean will help you learn you're wrong fast enough. So then you have the time to correct course. So I think that's what you were talking about and trying to drive this mindset in the end.
Exactly.
And one thing that I want to look at. So you have created many tools, and you're still creating more. Which is the tool that helps you the most? Like I'm curious to know like what you're using more on your day to day, and this is a that's the one, and I want to know why.
So I think it varies by stage of the project or product that I'm working on. So in the very beginning, I'm still a user of my own Lean Canvas. I created a simpler version of it, the Leaner Canvas, which just takes the customer and problem boxes. And usually, whenever I start with any new idea, I start asking myself, is there enough evidence? Are there enough people with a problem we're solving? Like that's the first question that I try to ask. So I go towards the lean or leaner canvas. Then I will do some back of the envelope calculations to look at market sizing and just like impact, and this again is something that I talk about in my second book, which is every idea is going to take time to make it work, and so we want to make sure that if we are investing our time, it's going to be worth it at the end. So I like to think of what is my minimum success criteria. When I was writing my first book, I wanted to sell. I came up with not how everyone wants to sell millions of books, but that is hard to like plan for. But I said no. Instead of thinking of maximum upside, my minimum would be 10,000 books, and this is when I was just doing this on the side. If I can sell 10,000 books in less than 2 years, that would be interesting. So I started asking myself, how can I test that I have an audience big enough to sell 10,000 books? So that to me is my next tool that I use with every initiative is what's my minimum success criteria that I time box. And then over time, I think there are just different tools. But more recently, I'm using some AI stuff for like customer interviews, and it's actually quite interesting to speed up the analysis process. So that's
Hmm.
maybe kind of a newer tool that I'm exploring and working with. But it does vary by stage of the product.
Minimum success criteria. It's a term that I wish I had learned before. It's quite interesting. I generally try thinking, what does success look like?
Mhm.
But success might be in my optimistic way. So,
Yeah,
what is the minimum success? I think many people can benefit from that. Those watching
sure.
minimum success criteria. That's a
Yeah, so
great
so
one.
so 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 so, so to me, it's about creating a time box. When I work with startups, most startups, their journey to product market fit is about a 2 year journey. And so I say, let's add an extra year and make it 3 years. And most people can come up with a 3 year plan. Year one is I'm going to build my product. Year two is I'm going to make it, work, launch it, make it work. And then year three, I start growing and scaling it. So in a startup, product market fit or that hockey stick needs to start growing very fast about that 2.5 year point. So in that context, I would go to a startup and say, what is your minimum success criteria 3 years from now when this is working? What does that mean to you? So in terms of either revenue or in terms of team size or in terms of lifestyle, like what is that? If I'm working with a corporate, it would be talking to a stakeholder like a VP and saying 3 years from now, when you're reviewing projects that you're going to fund, what is your minimum success criteria? So is it going to be revenue or market share? Like what's it going to be from a stakeholder perspective? And knowing that in the beginning is very helpful for the innovators and the entrepreneurs because now they can start testing their ideas and see, is it even going to be possible? And if it's
Yeah.
impossible, why are we working on this thing? So that's how I defined it. So for me, with the books, it was how many books would make it so it was not a waste of time. If I sold less than 10,000 books, to me, that would not be all that interesting to do all this much work. But if I sold more than 10,000, if I sold 100,000, I'd be very, very happy. So how do I figure out what that minimum number is?
Hmm. And that's a very different way of looking at things because sometimes it's like, how long does it take for us to build this? And the question is like, what does success look like? And then we can decide if we want to invest time into that.
Right. Right. And the other
Meaning.
thing I'll just throw out here is that powers of 10 is very helpful. Sometimes people get very confused and they say they go and do a lot of spreadsheets and analysis to figure out what their minimum success criteria is. And I think I should tell them just think in powers of 10. So if I look at my books, I can sell 1 million books or 100,000 books or 10,000 books or 1,000 books or 100 books, right? Somewhere there is everyone can pick a number and say, okay, this is what I would consider my minimum, and then we can get a bit more precise. But just starting with powers of 10 is a very fast way of saying I'm kind of here. With startups, I see many startups. Some of them are building unicorns. Some of them just want to do a solopreneur thing. So they're building $100,000 business versus $100 million business, and they are very, very different. This level of you can say skill or team and effort that goes into building them is different. But knowing
Mhm.
that upfront gives you a lot of comfort and removes stress, because if I don't want to build a unicorn, then I don't need to be pretending like a unicorn founder. I can be a lot more relaxed.
Yeah,
So yeah,
power of 10. That's a great tip. When I started with the idea of writing a book, I was looking at this, said, I'm going to post on LinkedIn and say I'm writing a book and see how people react. And the power of 10, in this case, I said, I need to have at least 100 reactions to that. If I don't have 100 reactions, it means that people couldn't care less about it. So I'm not going to even bother about it. So I
yeah,
started there and then I said, all right, let's see how many people are going to fill up my survey. And then I said, it needs to be minimum of 1,000. I don't get there, so then I move on. I said, I move on. It's all right. It's fine. And it's about deciding, do I want to invest on this? How is it going and so on. And that gave me orientation and then I went to 10 interviews. I like the number also. I started with 10 and then I got people there to see what are the real pains and then said, okay, let's start shaping things. But it's about the size, right? This level of reach you want to achieve exactly, and then you make a decision of and
yeah.
you set expectation. I think it's very important with expectation.
Yes, and it's exactly the same process that I use, and it was almost exactly the same numbers. And so for me, I wanted to get 1,000 people who were committed to buy the book, and I didn't write anything until I got that. So it also helps you focus. So if you aren't getting 1,000 people, then let's work on that. Let's do more LinkedIn posts. Let's talk about what the book is. Maybe we frame the problem differently. But that is the time best spent to see. Don't write something and hope people will then come back later and buy. If they're not bought it now, they're not going to buy it later. So let's fix that. Let's fix that problem first, that risk first.
Let's fix that risk first. So once you want to write a book, so you need to start with the math. So what is the end of the game? And then it's the same. The risk is assumption. So if you get it wrong, the problem framing, then you can write whatever book you want. You don't get people to buy it, as you said. So we are coming to the end, and I want to know if is there any other thought you want to leave to those watching?
I think I always kind of end things with problems over solutions. And I think this is, again, one of those ideas that is very commonsensical. But I share this analogy is that for product folks, it's particularly Daniel Kahneman, who was one of my heroes, behavioral psychologist, recently passed away, but he famously observed that the smarter people are, like economists, he worked with a lot of economists, they get even more biased by noise in the data. So it's kind of very absurd because you would think they would be more critical, but they get more biased. And I find the same to be true with product people because we love products so much we get more enamored with solutions, and we always think we understand the problems. And I would just encourage everyone to almost pretend like you don't know anything about the problem, even if you think it's obvious, and go talk to a customer and go beyond the surface. It's very easy for a customer to say, oh yeah, I want something that's fast, and you think you're building something that's fast, but what does fast really mean? When you go below the surface, you might realize that fast to the customer is not fast to you, and they're completely different things. So to me, that's what I would probably leave people with is you almost have to go below the surface level stuff to root causes. Why are people truly struggling? And that's where the powerful insights live. That's where the next big ideas, which are in hindsight very simple. When we look at what Facebook or Airbnb or things, Starbucks do, kind of very simple. A lot of people come to me and say, I had the same idea. I'm like, yeah, but you didn't act on it, and it was not that was too simple, and you kind of ignored it. And so that's how ideas are. but you have to chase the surface level stuff to get down to those deeper insights, I find.
This is a great insight, and it's something you said, like, yeah, it's about the problem understanding, but it's about behaving as if you don't understand the problem and trying to understand the depth of it and bring more clarity and avoid words like fast. What is the meaning of fast? Better. What is better for you? Try and understand what is really the underneath thing that no one is talking about. Because as we talked here, you mentioned Steve Jobs. Customers are not going to serve their problems to you. You need to understand that.
Yep.
But we quickly, still, even if we have the right mindset, we quickly jump to solutions. Because I see this point you mentioned, because everyone around you in a business wants solutions. They want solutions. We want to collect money from that. And you, as a product person, you also want solutions. So slow down, understand that. I love that. It's amazing. And Ash, where should people reach out to you to connect and hear more about what you're working on?
Sure. So I'm pretty active these days on LinkedIn, so I would recommend connecting with me there. I try to post pretty regularly. Like yourself, I find you there constantly as well. So that's probably the place. If you are more interested in the tools, leancanvas.com is probably where I'll tell people to start. And there are some other products that we have along the way, but that's generally the starting point. So where I recommend checking things out.
Great. I will post all the links. No worries. Everyone can find it. It's been an absolute pleasure to get all of these lessons and lean, how to use it, what it is, what is not, how to apply, where to start. And I'm really looking forward to your upcoming book, Coaching Lean. This is really promising. And I think it's very important to the time where we are living, because what I see happening right now is we have an abundance of tools. So we need to understand what helps us and going back more to the lean mindset. And I'm really glad you are working on this book because it's going to help us a lot. Thanks for that.
Thank you, David. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you. So for everyone watching, don't forget, get his books, and the faster you pivot, the quicker you can succeed.